Hello, good afternoon to everybody. Welcome to the third and last session of the workshop on the politics of the new right in Latin America. I'd like to start this session by saying thanks to our discussants, Noah Lupan and Elizabeth Zeichmaster, who have kindly accepted to comment the papers that will be presented today. This session will have three papers that focus on the profile of right-wing voters and recent trends in party system polarization. Professor Vladimir Gramacho, who is a friend and a faculty colleague here at the University of Brasilia, he'll be sharing the session, and with no further delay, I will ask him to organize and start the presentations. Thanks.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Andrea, for the introduction and for inviting me to chair this last session of the workshop on the politics of the new right in Latin America. As far as I understood, Andrea is expecting me to follow the rightist law and order principle and give only 12 minutes to the participants. But don't worry, guys, I'll give you 3 more minutes. So enjoy your presentations and the discussion that will follow each presentation. In this session, we will have three papers. The first one will be Mapping the Right-Wing Electorate in Contemporary Chile by Ariel Becerra and Cristóbal Rovira Kaltwasser from Universidad Diego Portales. And the discussant will be Elizabeth Zeichmaster from Vanderbilt University. The second paper will be Religion and the Right, the case of 2018 election of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil by Mateus Ferreira and Mario Fuchs from Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, and by Amy Erica Smith from University of Iowa. And the discussant will be Elizabeth Zeichmaster as well. The third and last paper in the session will be the ideological roots of the new right, party system polarization in Latin America by Robert Lee Vidigal from Stony Brook University and by André Borges from Universidade de Brasília. The discussant in this case will be Noam Lupo from Vanderbilt University. So, without more delays, I would ask Ariel and Cristóbal to start their presentation. And please, the floor is yours.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much for the invitation, for being here today and for presenting our paper. And let me start sharing screen, first of all. Let's hope that this is going to work. I'm just trying to find it. Just finding the file. Give me 1 second. You're still seeing, you don't see the PowerPoint, or I get it right? Let me try it again.
No, we don't.
It seems that something, let me. So now I think that should be working if I get it right.
Yes.
Yes, now you see it. Okay, apologies for the delay, but now we can start. As you can see here, this is a paper that I have prepared with my friend and colleague Ariel Becerra. So I will start with the presentation and he will finish with the last slides. So I will do the more introductory part, and the most interesting analysis. In fact, Ariel is going to be in charge of that part. So as you can see here, the title of our paper, it's called Loving and Hating the Right, an empirical analysis of positive and negative partisanship towards the different rights in contemporary Chile. And the idea of the paper and also of the presentation, as you can see here, is that we are going to divide it in 4 parts. First, I'm going to talk briefly about the right in contemporary Chile. Then I will talk about positive and negative partisanship in contemporary Chile. Then we will move to the profile of those who have positive and negative partisanship towards the different rights in contemporary Chile. And finally, some concluding remarks on the main findings of our paper. So let me start then with the first part, and this is about the right in contemporary Chile. Those of you who are familiar with Chile might know that the country now has 4 different right-wing parties that are established in the political arena. So if you can see first in the left side, there are 3 parties that form the current government coalition. This is UDI, Unión Demócrata Independiente. Secondly, there is Renovación Nacional, and these are the 2 historical parties, so to say, that were able to establish themselves after the transition to democracy in 1990. There is a relatively new party that is called Evópoli, which is also part of the current government coalition, but this party was created in 2015, and is a sort of a right-wing party that tries to have a bit more of a liberal profile. And lastly, there is this 4th party, which is called Partido Republicano, and this is a newcomer, and this is our own populist radical right party in the Chilean case, so with a similar agenda of the one of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. The main difference, again, is Partido Republicano is not part of the current government coalition, and this makes quite interesting because there is an open competition between these 4 parties, but particularly between the 3 parties that are in government and this party that is in opposition. Nevertheless, as we put here in our PowerPoint presentation, we have very limited research about the similarities and differences between these different parties, particularly when it comes to trying to understand who are those who love and hate these different parties. And this is the main research gap that we try to address in our paper. So how we try to address this research gap? And we do it in the following way. We work with a face-to-face survey that is representative of the adult population in Chile, of the urban population. It's a relatively good survey, I would say. It's 1,500 cases. And what is quite interesting is that it's a very recent survey. The fieldwork was undertaken just after the constitutional referendum. This means that took place between the end of 2020, so mainly in November of December of last year. And as you can see here, we use our own measurement for trying to tap into positive and negative partisanship. To a certain extent, it's not our own measure because that was created by a friend and colleague of us, Carlos Melendez, who presented a paper on 2 days ago. And we took the following question, as you can see here, just putting the UDI as an example, and we asked each of the 1,500 people that were surveyed, we asked, so let's suppose that there are going to be elections in Chile. Would you vote for a candidate of the UDI for mayor, deputy, and senator? And if someone tells me that will definitely vote for that party or will probably vote for that party, we consider that that person has a positive identity towards the UDI. And by contrast, if someone tells me that will definitely not vote for that party or probably will not vote for that party, then we categorize that person as someone who has a negative identity towards the UDI. So based on that classification, I will present you first some descriptive statistics. And after that, Ariel will take part of the presentation, and he will present much more the logic models that we created to better understand the profile of those who love and hate these different right-wing parties in contemporary Chile. So if we go to the descriptive statistics first, here we present data for all the different parties that we measured in contemporary Chile, and the red boxes are the right-wing parties. And as you can see here, the first issue that it's interesting to know is that right-wing parties tend to have, in comparison to other parties, not very high numbers of positive identification and tend to have relatively higher numbers of negative identification. And this is particularly true for the two new parties that have entered into the electoral arena in Chile. On the one hand, Acción Republicana, AR, as you can see here, this is a populist radical right party. And on the other hand, towards Evópoli, this is the liberal right-wing party. And in the case of UDI and RN, the two traditional right-wing parties, that they have relatively similar levels of identification. If you see a bit more than 20% of positive identity, and roughly 70% on average of negative identity. And as you can see, just by comparing to the Partido Socialista, they have worse scores than the Partido Socialista, which has roughly 30% of positive identification and 60%.
Cristóbal.
Yes?
Would you please just move to the presentation mode? We can't see your slides, so we are still...
Apologies.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
we missed all slides that came before. Thank you very much.
Sorry. Now you can see it, or are you seeing now the slides, or no? You're still not. Now you're seeing the slides, or?
Yes. No.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Apologies. I didn't check that you were not seeing the slides. So as I was telling here, it's again the slide in which you see the percentage of positive and negative identity for the different parties. I recall again, this is the share for the red boxes are the right-wing parties, and as you can see here again on the right side, it's Acción Republicana and Evópoli, and these are parties that these are the new right-wing parties, and they tend to have very high numbers of negative identity, and they tend to have a lower numbers of positive identity. So if I move, then I'm not very sure how should I work, because I have two different slides here, but I think that now if I move to the next one, then you can see.
So maybe it's more easy.
So now you can see the next bar, or because I get a bit lost with the system here. You are seeing now that's the next one, or? Yes. So that's the next slide, in which we also present some additional data that's important, and this is the amount of people that don't answer our questions. And I think this is important because, as you can see here, Acción Republicana and Evópoli tend to have high number of people that don't answer our question, roughly 30% of the electorate. And we think that this is related to the fact that these parties are relatively new in contemporary Chile. And because of that, there are many people that are still not aware of this party brand, so to say. And this is quite different from other parties that are much more established in the electoral arena, that tend to have lower rates of people that are not answering those questions, so to say. And the next slide then that I want to present, let me go again to this. It's the following, in which we create some additional information now to better understand the profile of those who have the positive and negative identity towards the different parties. And as you can see here, we created two axes in which we have the typical question on the one hand, state versus market, and that's the one that you see on this side here. And the vertical one and the horizontal one, it's a typical question whether are people against or in favor of moral issues. And this is a way in which we try to tap into these different right-wing parties. And also we put the green value that you can see here is the average for our whole sample. And it shows in this sense to what extent those who identify positively with these parties tend to be much more on the right-wing camp in comparison to the median voter, so to say. And we do exactly the same with the opposite. We present that now for negative partisanship here. And here you can see those who are against these right-wing parties that, to a certain extent, of course, tend to be left-wingers, but in these different dimensions that we present here. So, and I think without further ado, then I give the word to Ariel, who will present the models that we created with our data.
Thank you, Cristóbal. Well, continuing with the inferential analysis about the positive and negative identity, we can see that the ideological scale variable is the most important variable in each model, since being from the right seems to be one of the most important things among all the positive identities of the parties analyzed. The populist indicator is also significant, but with a negative indicator, This means that those who identified with the right identities reject populist ideas. Then the immigration index, those who identified with these identities generate a resection of the immigrant in the country in almost all the identity analyses. An important point to highlight is the positive identity for the Acción Republicana, since those who identify with this party declare themselves conservative and reject that democracy is the best system of government. In the next slide,
Yes, let's
we
go.
can. Thank you. We can see as a mirror effect the variable that is significant among all the negative identities is the ideological variable, but among those who declare themselves identified with the sector of the left, while among the positive identities they reject the populist indicator, the negative identities are in a favor. We have two hypotheses that could explain this. The first is that indeed the citizens identified with the sector of the left are agree with the populist ideas. The second hypothesis is reloaded that resection of the parties that make up a current government. Perhaps people agree with ideas proposed in the populist indicator as a result of rejection of the current government generated in people. Perhaps in future studies, people on the left do not agree so much with the populist ideas. Another important result is the immigration index for the negative identities for the UDI and RN that are in favor of immigrants in the country. Finally, something very important that we can observe in the models is that those who reject the Acción Republicana identity consider themselves liberal, in a favor of democracy, and come from higher economic sector in the country. Mm, uh, mm, yes. In conclusion, concluding remarks, although there is growing research on the different right-wing parties that exist in contemporary Chile, we have a little knowledge about those who love and damn these parties. UDI and RN have lower levels of positive partisanship than the Partido Socialista and the Partido Demócrata Cristiano, while Acción Republicana and Evópoli have high level of negative partisanship. Those who have a positive identity toward the different right-wing parties in contemporary Chile share only commonality: they define themselves as right-wingers. Finally, those who have a positive identity toward Acción Republicana have a peculiar profile, since they not only define themselves as a right-winger and conservative, but also are at odds with the democracy. Therefore, it's not far-fetched to categorize Acción Republicana as an extreme right-wing party.
Okay, thank you guys. Thank you, Ariel and Cristobal, for being for taking care of the time and for your presentation. I would like to ask Amy Smith to come to the floor and present her paper with Mateus Ferreira and Mario Fuchs, Religion and the Right, the case of 2018 election of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. Please, Amy.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank
Amy,
you so much.
yes,
Yes.
I would ask you also to use the presentation mode so we can see the full screen with your data and text, okay?
Yeah, I will try.
Thank you.
It seems like maybe the presentation mode hasn't been working for other people. I'm not sure. I'm going to, we'll see what happens. You'll have to give me
Yes,
feedback about what's going on here.
it's gonna work.
Okay. So hi everybody. I have to apologize that I have many family conflicts all happening simultaneously that involve minor family emergency plus my children's first day of school. So I'm going to need to talk for only about 8 minutes, of which I've already used 30 seconds or so, because I need to get out of here in order to go pick up my younger son from school. So with no further ado, I will start sharing, and I'm going to be brief and skip through some of the slides, and it will be what it will be. Okay, let's see. Okay, you all are seeing my presentation right now, right? Yes, you are. Okay, good. I can see myself. And what happens if I do this? Can you all see my slide now? Okay, now I can't see. I can't see myself now. So can you all see? Are you all seeing my full screen presentation? Can somebody tell me that? Sorry, I can't hear from anybody. I'm going to assume that you all are seeing my full screen presentation. Sorry. I would hate to. No, still in non-presentation mode. Okay, it was in presentation mode from my end. It was indeed in presentation mode, which means that there was something wrong with how it's showing things. Okay. So can you all see it now if I flip to the next slide? Yes, you all can see that. Okay, good. All right, so presentation mode doesn't actually seem to be working, but just keeping it in the non-presentation mode does seem to be working. Okay. All right, so thank you all for being here. And again, apologies for the fact that I need to make this brief. What I'm going to be presenting today is work co-authored with Mateus Ferreira, who is a doctoral candidate at the Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, the Federal University of Minas Gerais, and Mario Fuchs, who is a professor at the Federal University of Minas Gerais. So the purpose of this paper is to understand the how religion influenced the rise of Jair Bolsonaro. These are two different images, two famous images of Jair Bolsonaro. The first is the one on the left, is a picture of him from the March for Jesus in 2019, after he was elected. The March for Jesus is ostensibly doesn't have any, particular religious identification in the title, but is a march that is associated with the evangelical church. Whereas the image on the right is his campaign slogan, which was "Brazil above everything, God above everyone." And this is a campaign slogan it's overtly Christian nationalist. It explicitly doesn't talk about any particular religious affiliation. The notion is that Brazil is a Christian nationalist nation without any particular religious affiliation. So the question is it about religious affiliation, or is it about evangelical identity, or some combination thereof? So what we know from lots of literature, from public opinion polls during the election campaign, during the 2018 election campaign, as well as prior work, including my own and that of Mario Fuchs and Mateus Ferreira, is that evangelicals swung the 2018 election to Bolsonaro. By a number of different people's estimates, Bolsonaro would probably have narrowly lost the 2018 election if not for evangelicals. And one of the interesting things that we focus in on in this paper is trying to explain why that happened, and trying to and we show that much of evangelicals' swing to Bolsonaro actually happened during the election campaign. So evangelicals started the election campaign slightly more supportive of Bolsonaro than other religious voters, and they swung massively towards him during the campaign. So the question is why? I have only about 4 minutes left, so I'm just going to tell you why. First of all, would tell you that this is unusual. Evangelicals have not historically voted en masse for any particular candidate, and they've historically not all glommed on to any particular candidate during the campaign. So the argument here is that evangelicals were attracted to Bolsonaro first because he very effectively used sexuality politics issues, which were the issues that they were most strongly attracted to. So they were attracted to the specific issues on which he campaigned strongly. And then their campaign effects took over in the midst of campaigns. So one of the things that we show in our presentation, in our paper, is this figure here shows that there was a tremendous move towards Bolsonaro. The probability of moving towards Bolsonaro during the campaign was much higher for Pentecostals and to a lesser extent for evangelical non-Pentecostals than for members of any other religious group. The reason for that, we argue, relates to discussion in churches. We show that the discussions in churches were that discussion of the election in churches was really strong, was really prominent, and that that there was a very high level of endorsement of Bolsonaro in churches. This is, by the way, very, very different from any other election. I've been studying religion and politics in Brazil for about over a decade now, and studying elections and studying discussion in churches. I've never found this high a level of discussion of particular candidates or of endorsement of particular candidates in churches. So very high levels of clergy endorsement of Bolsonaro during the election, as well as high levels of discussion in churches. Then we run some regression models using our panel data. We find complex, inconclusive results in our panel models that would seem to suggest that there was an impact of church leader support for Bolsonaro, particularly that church leader support for Bolsonaro in particular influenced changing towards Bolsonaro after the second round election. Okay, with that, I'm going to sign off because I need to get out of here to do my family things. I will be back online to listen to Liz's comments in about 25 minutes to half an hour. Okay, thank you all very much, and apologies again for the crazy day.
Okay, thank you, Amy. So the next presentation will be made by Robert Lee Vidigal from Stony Brook University. It's a paper co-authored with André Borges. Okay, Robert, please take the floor.
All right, can you hear me well?
Yes.
All right, let me try.
And please use the presentation mode if you can.
I would try. Let's see. So I guess you can see my screen. Yeah. Okay, let's just make sure it's moving. I got a yes. All right. Okay, so thank you so much, Vladimir. Really happy to be here to present this first draft of this new working paper that I have with Andre. And this is another research agenda that I have around political conflict and ideology in Latin America. So the paper is entitled The Ideological Roots of the New Right, Economic Distress, Cultural Backlash, and Polarization in Latin America. So after the left turn, the rise of new right-wing leaders transformed the electoral competition and polarization dynamics in Latin American party systems. So in the past, we saw the rise of right-wing leaders in Nicaragua, Ecuador. We can see clear in this map on the screen, Chile, Brazil, Peru, Paraguay, and more recently, Colombia. So after a decade, the region looks very different in terms of national government's ideology. However, polarization has not increased everywhere. So what explains this variation? In this study, we seek to assess whether polarization increase is related to the ideological reorganization of the political right. So here we examine ideological polarization in the left-right dimension in the lower chamber for 16 Latin American countries up to 2019. So broadly speaking, scholars have relied on two major types of explanations to account for the rise of extremist leaders over mainstream parties, and also related increase in polarization. So in Latin America, the literature has demonstrated already that major economic crises may lead to party breakdown and consequently party system collapse, creating an opportunity for outsider candidates. On the other hand, cultural explanations argue that voter social cleavages originated not from economic inequality, but from generational value shifts. So in this scenario, where many conservative voters felt displaced, political entrepreneurs have an opportunity to break in by organizing new parties around conservative agendas. We can learn a lot from these exogenous economic shocks and also these changing political identities, but here we turn our attention to ideology and elite behavior. We argue that party system polarization in Latin America has increased as a result of right-wing elites' response to progressive change throughout the left turn. So how political elites' behavior change when facing different incumbents is important. So our main hypothesis rests on the conditional effects of the left-wing incumbents' level of policy liberalism. So here we draw on the literature of candidate position taking and ideology in congressional elections to hypothesize on the rise of right-wing candidates in the region. So why is ideologism important? Well, not surprisingly, ideologies pervade those most deeply invested in the business of politics. But for those not highly invested, still, political ideologies offer these organized frameworks of managing political complexity in a variety of domains. So ideologies provide these rationales for why and in what ways societies function, and also how they should ideally be organized. But most importantly is that, in large part, political conflict reflects this discursive work of parties and their leaders who package different issue positions and values into competing ideological frameworks that voters choose from. So political elites rely on these ideological abstractions to organize their platforms and structure political competition. And they often behave strategically to shape political conflict. So we argue that political polarization can be maintained and exacerbated by the behavior of individual politicians. So for example, whether or not to run elections, whether or not to position themselves on important salient issues, or to take clear ideological positions. So left-right competition tends to be institutionally adaptive across time and context. So what I'm trying to say here is that when elites perceive that certain activities will provide some sort of electoral reward, they will do it, such as restructuring relations within the party system, or promoting the formation or destruction of political identities. So, for example, when a left-wing party in favor of progressive reforms is in power, right-wing parties should have an easier time in appealing to voters dissatisfied with the incumbent's policies, and also in building this polarizing rhetoric or narrative. But when left-leaning incumbent adopts only these moderate progressive views on issues, it will be more difficult for right-wing challengers to pursue polarizing strategy. So to put it another way, what we expect is that left-wing governments in Latin America to trigger this elite-led polarization only when they score high on political and moral liberalism. So we can think in another scenario, like when a right-wing party is in power. So when this incumbent is a right-leaning party or holds more centrist views, we would expect that radical right challengers to face a more difficult task. In this scenario, it should be harder for a polarizing narrative around the simple left and right opposition. So putting these three literatures together, we produce three hypotheses. So our first hypothesis is related to the economic variables. The second one is related to cultural accounts. And finally, our third hypothesis, our main hypothesis, is related to ideology and elite behavior. So we test this hypothesis with the data set of parties, elections, and ideology in Latin America. Our dependent variable is party system level polarization in the lower chamber. And here, it's a descriptive plot of party polarization in the region. And just to further clarify, this measure calculates how spread out the parties are in the left-right policy dimension, so that higher values indicate larger differences in the party system polarization. So looking across the plots, the results suggest that there's a lot of variation in the polarization levels across countries. But when we look at the pooled plot on the bottom, not sure if you guys can see my my mouse, there is a general tendency of increase. So to test the first hypothesis, we use a measure of the cumulative GDP change in the 4 years preceding the election. For the second hypothesis, a measure of voter polarization taken from the various waves of the Latino barometer. And finally, for our main hypothesis is the interaction between policy liberalism and left-wing incumbency. So just to clarify what's this policy liberalism, it's an index that measures the party's commitment to basic liberal values in what concerns the separation between church and state and the advocacy of individual rights and liberties as opposed to traditional values. Important to note here is that we include another interaction for liberalism and center incumbents, so that right-wing incumbents are the reference category. Okay, so before showing you guys the statistical models results, we plotted the average left and right political parties' conservatism, just to assess whether right-wing parties have moved further to the right side, or if both sides of the ideological aisle have moved to the extremes. And there is interesting cases here, such as Brazil, Costa Rica, Mexico, and Uruguay. So this table presents different model specifications, okay? But I don't want to spend much time here because I want to focus on the results of our main model. And just to quickly summarize the hypothesis, we see that only H3 reaches significant results. Okay, so to better understand this interaction, we plotted the marginal effects for the interaction, and the results show that the interaction is in the expected direction. So the conditional effects of progressive policymaking on polarization are positive and significant only when the left-wing incumbent scores high on policy liberalism. So if you look here in the figure, it's only after we get to 10 or more that the curve reaches the positive side and is also statistically significant. I also plotted the other interaction for the centrist incumbents, and when we look at these marginal effects, the effects are simply null. And as I previously discussed, when the incumbent is a right-leaning party or it is more like centrist party, it's harder for the opposition or extremist right-wing party to construct this polarizing narrative around the left-right dichotomy. So we only find support for our third hypothesis. So we have some next steps in mind. So to run some robustness checks on the economic variables and try other variables such as inflation, unemployment, vary the GDP by 2 year, 1 year per capita, and also the success of left-wing economic agendas, such as income distribution or increase in the share of social spending. We also plan to include some lop-up measures to further proxy for possible mass level variables of polarization, and also trying to better proxy for moral and cultural issues amongst voters. And also, we will discuss the implications of polarization on democratic functioning. So just to wrap up, our statistical results show that progressive change led by leftist governments are yet another factor that may account for the party system polarization. And our findings suggest that polarization levels were higher where leftist incumbents scored high on political and moral liberalism. So our argument is that right-wing candidates articulating these conservative worldviews were able to run against the left-leaning incumbents and their progressive platforms by taking these stronger and extremist ideological positions against political and moral liberalism, as seen in countries such as Chile, Brazil, or El Salvador. Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to your comments, critiques, and suggestions.
Thank you, Robert. So we're going to have a small change now in the order of our session. We're going to start with Nolan Lupo, who's going to make comments on the paper just presented by Robert Lee Vidigal. And we will give Amy more time to come back to the session. So we will finish with the comments by Liz Eckmeister. So Nolan, please take the floor.
Thank you. Well, thanks everyone for being here, and thanks Robert and Andre for the paper and the invitation to be a part of this. So this is a really interesting paper and a really important topic that we have yet to really make a lot of progress on. So it's nice to see some work on this question of polarization, and more generally on the issue of the sort of interaction between voter preferences and elite behavior, and sort of what's driving what in these kind of aggregate level trends that we're seeing across the region and within countries. So a really important project, I think. Let me raise, I think, three kind of big picture questions or issues, and then turn to a bit more specific things about the empirics in this paper. So first, kind of big picture question on polarization. Polarization is kind of a difficult term to use because it has really sort of two meanings. One way that we use polarization is to describe a dynamic change over time. Things are polarizing, right? So there's a discussion about change. And another is polarization as kind of a static characteristic of a political system, right? The level of polarization in a system at a particular point in time. Reading the paper, I wasn't always entirely sure which of those two is what actually you're interested in, and this is something I'll come back to in my comments about the empirics. But I think we need to sort of settle early on the sort of conceptual way that you're thinking about polarization. A second sort of big picture item is cultural backlash. So you sort of posit cultural backlash as this sort of second hypothesis in the paper, and you sort of characterize it as voters moving to the right on some set of issues that I would call sort of cultural issues or social cultural issues, and then you don't find evidence for this in the empirical analysis. Instead, you find evidence for this kind of third hypothesis, this sort of strategic story. But in a sense, the strategic story implies a certain kind of backlash, right? So voters who previously supported sort of a left or a center, or sort of an old right political option are now supporting these new right options, right? They might not be changing their sort of how they're responding to survey questions with regard to their sort of ideological position or their sort of left-right position, let's say, but they are changing how they vote in response to, something, potentially in response to, as you suggest, leftist incumbents kind of governing on the left or more on the left. So that, to me, does seem like a kind of backlash. And so something about the distinction between hypothesis 2 and hypothesis 3 here, I would need a little bit more clarity on. The last kind of big picture item, and this may have already come up in some of the prior discussions on other days. There's a really nice paper by Margit Tavits and a co-author, Letke. I think it's 2014, possibly AJPS. Their argument, and they're looking at Eastern Europe, their argument is that in highly unequal societies, right-wing parties can't win on socioeconomic issues or sort of a redistributive dimension. So instead, they run on social cultural issues, right? And those are places where they can win because majorities in these particular countries sort of are more conservative on social cultural issues. I wasn't sure how much of your story is all that different from their story. And if the stories are kind of similar, then I think the next question for Latin Americanists is what's changed, right? Why wasn't this sort of a winning strategy for right-wing, entrepreneurs, political entrepreneurs in the 80s and 90s, but suddenly it's become something more of a strategy that allows them to win? Or why didn't they pursue this strategy in the past, right? So those are sort of the bigger kind of conceptual questions that I have. On the empirics, I had sort of lots of questions about exactly what you were doing, and I think it's sort of details that didn't make it into the draft that I would say more about. I can say more about some of those things, but a few questions here. So the first is, I wasn't sure empirically how many dimensions we should be thinking about. Again, some of this work that you cite and work in this vein talks about sort of two different dimensions, right? The sort of socioeconomic redistributive dimension, as opposed to the social cultural dimension. At least in the way that you're sort of modeling this empirically, it seems to me that those things are being kind of collapsed into a single dimension. But it seems to me that cultural backlash story is actually one that kind of focuses more on the social cultural issue dimension. So I wonder if there's something empirically that you can do to distinguish those dimensions here as well. There's several statements in the paper that say polarization has increased in the region. I think in the presentation, actually, it was a little bit more nuanced. There's variation. But looking at that first figure, figure 1, in the paper, I'm not entirely sure that we can say that polarization has increased across the region. I guess one question that that characterization raises is since when. If you go back to sort of the beginning of the time series for each of the countries, there's actually about as many countries where polarization increases as there are countries where it decreases or stays the same. The pooled figure, as Robert mentioned in the presentation, does show sort of a slight increase in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And I wonder how much of that pooled change is being driven by a couple of very highly polarized countries whose data points enter the data set in the late 1990s and 2000s, in particular El Salvador and Nicaragua, for which you don't have data prior to that, but then they come in way at the top in those years. On the flip side, one thing I was wondering about these, looking at these trends, you see, for instance, in the early 2000s, polarization in Venezuela drops dramatically. Polarization in Nicaragua drops dramatically over the 2000s and 2010s. Right, that's actually sort of artificially low polarization in the legislature that's generated by the fact that the opposition decided not to run in elections in Venezuela, and Nicaragua has done all sorts of things to make the playing field less level in order to get sort of higher majorities in the legislature. So some way of accounting for that, I think, is going to be important if what we want to study is actually legislative polarization that's driven either by voters or by party competition and not by these other things going on. Getting back to what I was saying about sort of clarifying what you're doing in the analysis, I wasn't entirely sure sort of what the time period ends up being, because there's polarization data that go further back, but the mass data, the public opinion data, don't start until the 1990s. I wondered about presidential versus legislative elections. So, some things are being measured when there are presidential elections, and at the presidential level, some things are being measured, especially polarization at the legislative level, and how you think about those things interacting. And a more general discussion, a lot of this is based on expert coding, so a bit more of a discussion about how that works and how that's being done. One last thing on the expert coding, I always wonder, and I'm sure many of us have been asked to do these things over the years, and I always wonder when I'm being asked to do these things, whether I'm being asked to code presidents or parties as they governed in office or as they ran for office. And I think that's a really important distinction. Certainly it would have been an important distinction in the sort of era of policy switching and sort of neoliberalism by surprise. But it's, I think, still kind of a difficult issue to deal with. So, take the example in Argentina of Mauricio Macri, who ran on a platform that was not at all sort of based on kind of, right-leaning policy orientation, but then comes into office and puts together a cabinet that's very much, sort of economically liberal and conservative in social and cultural ways. And you see those things actually in the perceptions of voters as well. When he ran in 2015, was perceived as very much a centrist, and running in 2019 was perceived much more to the right. It would be useful to think through some of that. What's actually being coded here, and what matters theoretically as well. Two last things I'll say on the empirics. The measure of voter polarization, which comes from the Latino barometer data, especially because you're interested in change over time, I would be very careful with the data prior to the mid-2000s or so. There is some information that you can download from the website about representativeness in those sort of first 10 or so years. In many countries, those samples are not nationally representative. They're major cities and things like that, right? So change over time is actually change being driven by a changing sample rather than a change being driven, sort of by other things, actually reflecting kind of national level changes. I said two things, but two more things. The models of change, and here I come back to this question of are we thinking about change, or are we thinking about levels? The model specification is actually being driven, except for the fixed effects model, is being driven by levels. And again, if you look at figure 1, it seems to me, especially if we're only starting in the mid-1990s, most of the variation there is going to be driven by across countries, right? With some countries being very high and some countries being very low on polarization, rather than change within countries. It seems to me like the sort of theory is actually about change within countries. And so, I think some discussion about how the modeling strategy is really reflecting the theories that you're trying to test. And then finally, I think it would be really useful to have 3 or 4 cases that you can discuss sort of what happened, and have some public opinion data for those cases. Obviously, panel survey data would be fantastic. We have very few of those. But just some case discussions, I think, would be really useful and help the empirical analysis be even more convincing than it is. I'll leave it there, and thanks.
Thank you, Noam. Thank you for your comments and for your time. So I will now turn it over Elizabeth Zachmeister, who's going to comment on the papers about Chile and Brazil. Please. I hope Amy is back and can hear the comments.
All right. Great, here I am. Hi, everyone. Great to be here today. Really like the format for this workshop. It was a neat idea to spread it across a number of different days. Really great papers all around, and I'm just glad to be a part of it. So it's good to see you guys here, and thanks for having me. So I'm going to talk about the papers on Chile and on Brazil, and I'll start with the paper by Ariel and Cristobal on Chile. So this is a really fascinating paper because it reveals the fluidity and the diversity, and I would say perhaps the potential of the political right in Chile. And taking stock of what the authors find, there are new parties, there are people who are not attached, and policies and programs seem to be a fairly weak part of the story. And that doesn't surprise me. I think it's what we would expect to find in a system that has been experiencing low levels of partisanship at the mass level and signs of fracturing, experimenting, and change at the elite level. But this particular case is a really excellent example of that type of party system evolution. And so I found it really fascinating and interesting to read about. And I think it's just a really important case study in this sense when we're trying to understand what does the political right look like. So I think that the authors are correct that we need to understand and describe the diversity of the right. But I also wanted to better understand what the source of that diversity is. And here I wanted to hear the authors at least talk a little bit about, is this a top-down story or is this a bottom-up story? It seems like there's some potential to sort of describe the emergence of Acción Republicana and their sort of supporters, their adherents, as coming from a sort of long persisting quasi, maybe not entirely quasi dormant, maybe not entirely dormant cleavage that is being activated, which is a cleavage around democracy, right? But then in the paper, there's also this focus on the recent constitutional referendum and contemporary populism, and all that raises the idea that the authors sort of think that these dynamics are somehow sort of being influenced by current events or by current leaders, and I wasn't entirely sure where the author's frame was there, and I really wanted to hear more about that. I think that the sort of deep dive into that might be the next paper, but I think telling us a little bit about what you're thinking would be helpful. I really love the approach to identifying partisans by asking about whether people would or would not vote for candidates at different levels. I think that gets at partisanship in practice in a really useful way in a country in which people have been very hesitant to express partisanship using conventional survey methods. So I think it's a really good part of the paper and value added here. And I also found it really kind of intuitively attractive to look at both love and hate. We've been discussing polarization, and there's a lot of work right now being done on affective polarization. And this seems really important. But I wasn't actually sure in practice what the gain is in this paper, either theoretically or empirically. Because it seems to me like this is really a paper about who supports the political right. It doesn't matter, who hates the political right. What's the analytical dimension on which we should be thinking about this? What leverage do we gain a sort of above and beyond looking at support for the right by looking at this concept of hate? And I'm not entirely sure. Empirically, so theoretically, I'm not entirely sure. That empirically, the results kind of in broad brushstrokes seem sort of similar. So I'd like to hear the authors sort of tell us more convincingly, theoretically and empirically, what do we gain by looking at both love and hate? Now, I mentioned that the paper shows, and the authors showed this in their presentation, that there is a large percentage of the population, even by this measure, that doesn't answer the question, that doesn't commit to sort of expressing sentiment towards a party or an attachment towards a party. And I think that that's really important. And I think that the paper could do more with this. Even with respect to sort of the more mainstream right parties, I think it was about a fifth of the sample declines to answer the sort of would you vote for this party question. And that seems, it's not new. Again, this is a country where there's been low levels of expressed partisanship, but it seems key to what's going on here, because seems to be an electorate that, at least large parts of it, is up for grabs. And so those non-respondents seem really important to take a close look at. In describing sort of who this contingency of right party supporters is and what's sort of driving their support for these parties, I really liked all of the measures that you put into the model. As I was sort of thinking it through, everything I thought of, you sort of had in the model. But then, and that creates a kitchen sink model, right? And I wonder then if you're subjecting certain variables to too tough of a test by including them in the model at the same time as other measures. So if for example, if left, right, or liberal, conservative capture policy attitudes, then you're subjecting policy attitudes or policy stances to a very tough test by including them in the model at the same time as these ideological labels. So I think it's interesting to find that the attachment to the left is or right predicts support for these parties, and I think we would expect that to be perhaps stronger than policy stances. But policy stances don't really seem to be given much of a fair shake if they're in the model at the same time as the left, right, or liberal, conservative stances. At least I'd like to see you kind of think that through theoretically and then empirically. A couple just small comments. I was very interested in the fact that you were able to do a face-to-face survey of the urban population during really tough times. Probably a little bit more on that in the appendix would be helpful. Sort of what were the precautions that were taken and how exactly was that implemented? But that's just me caring about the weeds of these things. I think the readers might want to know what the relevance is of the decision to focus on the urban population. So maybe that the answer is the relevance is this is a trivial question, that the where most of the voters are is in these urban populations, and so that's where we're studying people. But I would have liked to have heard a little bit more about that. It's easy for you to add in. I'll just end by kind of going back to where I was at the beginning, but from a different perspective, which is in thinking about like what to do with this paper. It takes a fascinating dive into support for right-wing parties in Chile and shows this diversity. But what I'd like to hear you do is like connect that to broader issues, right? Like, what do we learn about party system dynamics, about public opinion dynamics, about voter support for an emerging right or an evolving right by studying this case? And I think that there's a lot that we do learn, because, as I said, well, and this is just my opinion, so I'm really curious to hear what the authors say. Maybe they think I just have it entirely wrong, but it seems to me like what this case really allows us to see are the dynamics that churn through an evolving system and the ways in which parties are able to experiment and attract voters using different types of portfolios that activate different dimensions that are out there within the public, right? And then I'm sort of curious where the authors think these experimentations are going to go, right? Like, is one party going to emerge, the dominant party on the right? They seem to be kind of segmenting the population that might be attracted to the right, and ultimately, I'm not sure how long that can be sustained, because it doesn't seem to be a natural equilibrium for the right. So maybe some discussion in the end on that would be a great way to end the paper, if you were so compelled, and if you agree with me that these are the interesting dynamics. So thank you again for the opportunity to read the paper. I'm going to now turn to the paper on Brazil. So here, it's also another fascinating paper with a really interesting question. And the question here is, what factors are responsible for the quick alignment and surge of support by religious conservatives with respect to right-leaning politicians in general, but really, of course, primarily asked and investigated specifically with respect to the case of Brazil? So I'm actually gonna start in a way that sounds kind of nitpicky, but I'm sort of starting at the start, and then I'll try to get a bit bigger picture as I go. So the paper is interested in explaining shifting orientations among the public in Brazil, but sort of also in general. I'll get to that in a second. And it starts off talking about shifts among the public, but also a lot about shifts among elites. And this may seem like splitting hairs, but elites are sort of part of the explanation for the shifts in the public. So I found it a little bit, I would sharpen the focus or I would narrow in on the public from the beginning. And then the second thing to kind of reconcile in the beginning is the place of Brazil vis-a-vis the rest of Latin America, vis-a-vis the rest of the world, perhaps, but in particular, the rest of the region, because the paper starts out with a discussion of Fabricio Alvarado in Costa Rica, and then doesn't really sort of return back to the region. And the paper calls Brazil emblematic of something in the region. But then at the same time, you see in the paper, and you could hear this in America's presentation, Brazil also seems to be sort of something that's exceptional, right? So is Brazil emblematic of an outcome that we're seeing in the region? Is Brazil exceptional with respect to the dynamics that are generating that outcome? I wanted to have a little bit better sense of whether or not Brazil is taken as a sort of most likely case, a case where we're most likely to see the dynamics that you think are under the hood of changes that are elsewhere happening, or if Brazil is sort of emblematic in outcome, but really exceptional in terms of the dynamics that are underlying that outcome. So again, sort of starting off on points that seem a little nitpicky, but I think by tightening that frame, you sharpen the theoretical focus of the paper. And then the larger argument is able to come into sharper relief. And I want to see that tightened as well. So this is what I think you're arguing. I think you're arguing that there are two primary factors that explain the sort of surge in, or the very quick uptick in support for Bolsonaro among, in particular, evangelicals in Brazil during the campaign. And I think those two things are, one is sort of causal, one is causally prior to the other. And so in a sense, you're kind of developing this funnel of causality type argument. So the first part of the funnel begins a decade or more ago. And this is what we learned in Amy Erica's 2019 book, that the marketplace for religion and politics has shifted in Brazil. A cultural war has emerged with tensions sort of over time, increasing over time and spreading across the country. And it's in this context then that we need to study and understand what happens with Bolsonaro. So I think that's what your first point is. And then the second point is the more proximate cause, right? So the more proximate cause is the sort of focus of the paper, and that's the role that churches and messages within the churches play. But I understood you to, if we sort of think about both those causes, the sort of antecedent cause and then the proximate cause, or the sort of more distal cause and the more proximate one, in a sense, you're arguing that the shift was both sudden and not sudden, right? That it tips quickly, but it's rooted in the emergence over the last decade or more of an increasingly open tension between culturally conservative and culturally liberal groups. So if I got that right, then I think it maps really nicely onto Amy Erica's book. If I got that right, then maybe I understood Amy Erica's 2019 book. And that becomes the basis for the discussion of the second factor, which again is the focus of the paper, and that's the role that churches and messages from the pulpit in those churches play. And so in the funnel of causality schematic, the shifting marketplace and the culture war is the more distant factor, and the dynamics around churches and messages from the pulpit are the more proximate factor. And this is really important for a number of reasons. One reason I think is that it joins some other work in making a case that campaign dynamics matter. And that may sound trivial to some people, but there's a large body of research in US politics in particular that argues that campaigns have minimal effects on swaying voters. So I think there might be some connections to be made here to that, and also to some other comparative literature that does show cases in which campaign effects seem to be far more than minimal. So I'm thinking of like Ken Green's work on campaign effects in Mexico. But then wait, right? Because my question is this really about the campaign, about what politicians and parties are intentionally doing, or is it about what church leaders are doing during the campaign? And the campaign is not actually the key factor here. So I'm not sure what the answer is. There's sort of a swirl of factors that are discussed, right? There's the power of elite endorsements. There's a mention of fake news and social media consumption, and then church attendance as sort of being separate from receiving the messages when in church. So I think in the paper, there's sort of, in the end, kind of mixed results, as Amy Erica said, and maybe that's not surprising because there's sort of mixed theory at this point. It's not entirely clear kind of what's the theoretical thrust around this second, more proximate set of factors. And nailing that down theoretically is really important because it's going to matter empirically, right? So the theory needs to guide the choice of the model. And somewhat similar to the Chile paper, the paper has models with just a lot of variables thrown in there, right? And there are a lot of variables that in theory seem like they ought to be related. So if you look at, for example, support for abortion rights, it's not significant. Let's see, it's now I need to look. its significance changes across the models, going from pre-election poll to the campaign and the prediction of the shift in favor of Bolsonaro and the eventual vote for Bolsonaro. And my question there is, what's the message that's coming from the pulpit? Is it vote for this guy or millions of babies die? Because if so, then we'd expect policy conversion alongside candidate conversion, right? Is that we see a persuasion effect where people become more supportive of Bolsonaro, but they're also shifting their policy views, being more likely to express more conservative views, more likely to connect those to their voter choice. And I think we see a similar pattern for the variable measuring LGBT attitudes, but it's not significant, but it's sort of still kind of along those lines. So the question to try to be a little clearer is, do you have mediating variables in the model, right? So I need to better understand what the messages are that are coming to people while they're in church, because if they're about policy and candidate or policy and elections, then putting policy into the model again seems to just be soaking up a lot of the variance and maybe confounding your tests. There's other things in there like authoritarian values, some would say are sort of antecedent to other factors. Maybe they interact with church attendance or messages. Social media is controlled for, but it's also kind of part of the explanation for how campaign messages are being circulated. So I wasn't entirely sure sort of what the role is of social media vis-a-vis your core argument. So in sort of summary, I mean, a super engaging paper. I think it's really nice follow-up to the work that all the authors have been doing in this area, and it's just really great to see. And I think to summarize my comments, I just would like to see the theoretical frame tightened a bit, and then have that lead to a more nuanced empirical strategy. And then I'd like to see what the results are, and maybe they'll still be mixed. In which case, I'll be curious to hear what you have to say about that outcome. So those are my comments on the papers. I have more detailed ones, but I can send them to the authors offline. So thank you for having me here, and I'll step back now.
Okay, thank you, Liz. I'm gonna call the authors again to respond to the comments, and we're going to start with Ariel and Cristobal. Cristobal.
Okay, thank you very much, Liz, for these excellent comments. And to be honest, I agree 100% with all the comments and suggestions that you have made. I mean, this is sort of work in progress that we are developing. And with Ariel, in fact, we are working a bit like trying to look at what the data is telling us. Of course, we had certain hypotheses, but we're much more driven by the data, so to say, just to try to figure out which are the differences and similarities between these different electorates. But you are absolutely right that probably we should be able to try to better explain which are the main findings that we have, also from a theoretical perspective. And a couple of issues about some of the comments that you made. You're absolutely right about the aspect that there is still a fair big number of people that don't reply our answers, and probably we can try to look at them. So which are the ideological profile of those people who don't identify with parties? We just skip them. So we presented a descriptive stat saying this is roughly a third of the electorate, but in fact we can try to look at them, so and try to figure out how are they, so in terms of ideological profile, and this would be interesting to compare to our right-wing different profiles, so to say. Regarding the issue of love and hate, I think that there are theoretical and empirical reasons why it's important to do that, but briefly I would say that our findings also corroborate something that you are saying, that this is probably the existence of a latent dimension about this democracy authoritarianism, so to say, that is starting to gain traction because of the rise of this populist radical right party. And our measures of positive and negative partisanship toward that party is showing exactly that. So if you remember, for all the mainstream parties, so the only key issue at the end of the day is whether you identify as a right-wing, yes or no. But if you look at those who identify, love and hate the Acción Republicana, the populist radical right, then you see that other variables are much more important, and the democracy one kicks in, so to say. But this is something that probably we need to spell out much clearer. And this is related also to your question about whether it is a bottom-up or top-down dynamic. And our impression that it's a chicken and egg question, but I think it's, in my opinion, I think it's a bit more of a top-down issue, that you have like a political actor that is trying to politicize certain issues, and through that way, so these issues are getting saliency, and then you see these sectors of the electorate that are moving into that direction, so to say. But this is something that we can try to argue a bit clearer. But overall, thank you again. These are brilliant ideas about how to improve our paper. I don't know, Ariel, if you also want to jump in and add something to the observations at least already gave to us.
No, I agree with Cristobal and all the comments. Thanks very much, Elizabeth, for your comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ariel and Cristobal. I would like to ask Amy to come to answer the comments made by Liz. But first, I would make an invitation to the audience to make questions or write down some questions. I think we're going to have some time after the responses to take some questions from you. So Amy, please.
Thank you, Vladimir. All right, I just want to say thank you to Liz. These were very helpful comments. I agree with pretty much everything you said. Your interpretation of the argument is basically right. I mean, of course, this is, I think that you're right that in my understanding of the theoretical argument, of course, we've got a multi-authored paper, a multi-vocal paper right now, written by several people. But from my perspective, I think you've articulated what the argument is in the first part of the paper. That maybe we need to draw out a little bit more clearly in revisions. And I agree that, tightening the theoretical approach is a good idea. Tightening the frame is a good idea. And as far as the models go, there are a lot of variables. And we need to narrow down which are the variables we need to include in order to make the theoretical test more appropriate. So anyway, thank you. This is a long way of saying thank you so much for your comments.
Okay, thank you, Amy. So the last presenter to respond to some comments will be Robert Vidigal.
Okay. Wow, so first, thank you, Noah. I really appreciate the thoughtful comments, improving the manuscript. I will touch some points. If Andrea wants to chip in, please feel free. So yeah, I totally agree. I guess I have to differentiate the hypothesis a little bit better because I can see them being like confounding. Also, to describe more the expert survey. I really appreciate the literature recommendation, especially because I really enjoy reading comparative Eastern Europe papers. On the empirics, we need to test the model excluding a couple of countries to see how that changes. And I really like the idea to discuss 3 or 4 cases more in depth. So it gives more detail and evidence for the reader. I'm not sure if anybody wants to,
Okay, so thanks to Noah for these really great comments. I think that one point that is really important that we really need to deal with that is this paper you mentioned by Margaret Tavitz on Eastern Europe, which demonstrates that in highly unequal societies, right-wing parties, they can't win on social economic issues. So it is, we would expect these parties to campaign on cultural issues. And so why didn't this happen before? I think we still need to work on that, but probably one of the reasons is because in Latin America in the 2000s and 2010s, many countries experienced progressive change. For instance, in Colombia, there were several Supreme Court decisions that regarding same-sex marriage, LGBT rights, and it is probably the case that what is going on is that there is some progressive change and this is creating an opportunity for political entrepreneurs. I think we should also, while we were writing the paper, we came across a manuscript by Lucas Maia and Scott Desposato, where they show that the extension of LGBT rights in Latin America does not change voters' attitudes in Latin America. And I think this is the reason why we thought, well, if in the end the evidence is not showing cultural backlash among voters, then probably the explanation must be found among elites. So it's probably the case that it's not the voters that are moving. Actually, what's going on is that politicians, that they are taking advantage of these progressive changes, and then they are creating all this narrative regarding an atheistic and perverted left that is, attacking traditional values and so on and so forth. So probably one thing that we are hoping to do next is to use the same data that was used in the paper by Lucas Maia and Scott Desposato, where they created an index of LGBT rights. Because in this case, instead of using expert survey, then we would have the actual policy changes. Because in the end, I think that that's the most important. Unfortunately, we did not have the time to make this test. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we need to make all this much more clear, and also I agree that we must explain better whether we are trying to account for variation across countries in terms of levels of polarization, or if we are more interested in changes in polarization over time. Well, I personally think that we are more interested in explaining changes in polarization. And yes, you're right. I mean, we need to make that clearer in the paper. And thanks again for the excellent comments.
Okay, thank you, Robert and Andrea. I think we don't have any questions from the audience, so I would like to thank all presentations and authors who took part in this third session, as well as Liz Zachmeister and Noel Lupo for the relevant and specific comments made about the three papers. And I'm going to ask Andrea if he would like to make some final remarks about the session and the workshop. Please, Andrea.
Yeah, okay. So since we do not have any questions, I'd like to finish this session and the workshop saying thanks to all our discussants once again. I would also like to say thanks to our graduate students and to the staff of the Institute of Political Science who helped us to organize this event and also to spread the word about the workshop. Also say thanks to the audience, to everyone who has been listening to us during the last 3 days. We hope you have enjoyed the event. And the last thing, we will keep you posted. I mean, we do hope we will transform these papers into an edited collection. Well, if and when the book is published, we will let you know. And that's it. Thank you very much. Bye.